Hello everyone. This week, this week's CTFP seminar will be given by Carlota Andrés. Carlota received her PhD in 2017 from the University of Santiago in Spain. She has held several postdoc positions, including one at Jefferson Lab, and also the Laboratory of Instrumentation and Particle Physics, and also at MIT. She is currently an assistant researcher at École Polytechnique in France, Paris, where she's presenting from today, and is a recipient of the ERC Starting Grant. Her research focuses on quantum chromodynamics, heavy ion collisions, and the study of jets. And today her talk will be on jets and heavy ion collisions. So thank you. Carlota, you can start now.
So thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. I'm really happy to be part of this very nice seminar series you're organizing. And today, as you said, I will talk about jets in heavy ion collisions, which is my favorite topic. I will start by very briefly defining what jets are, and very rapidly I will move to heavy ion collisions. And I will try to motivate why I find these collisions so interesting, but also so challenging. And then I will move to jets in heavy ion collisions, and I will try to give you like an overview of the status of the study of jets in such collisions, and to convince you that they are excellent tools to advance the heavy ion program, and also try to tell you the things we have learned along these 25 years of a study of jets in heavy ion collisions, and what are the challenges we face when we try to do such studies. So you can interrupt if you have questions, so please feel free to interrupt. And I will start with jets. I'm going to do just a very brief introduction to jets. It's going to be kind of naive, but I hope it will be intuitive enough for you to follow the rest of the talk, which will be more focused on the jets in the heavy ion collisions. So what are jets? Well, jets are narrow sprays of particles that are detected in collider experiments. So I decided to start with this example of a proton-proton collision as measured by the Atlas detector at the LHC. And what you see here are these orange lines that are the tracks that the charged particles imprint on the detector. And these yellow and green cells, which are the energy that the particles deposit in the calorimeters. And what you see here very clearly is that there is a lot of energy very collimated in a given direction, and this is what we call a jet, or we reconstruct as a jet, and then also in the opposite direction. So what's going on here? What's going on is that when we collide protons, sometimes we have what we call hard scatterings. So these are scatterings between the protons that where there is a large transfer of energy or momentum. And that means that the outgoing particles of these scatterings are particles that go very far from the jet axis. So they go with they are produced with large energy, with large transverse momentum with respect to the jet axis, and they are back to back. So here there is like a cartoon of an example where we have had a hard scattering, and we have produced, in this case, I chose a quark and an anti-quark that are back to back with lots of energy. So these very hard photons and going of these hard scattering are gonna unavoidably radiate gluons, because this is a consequence of QCD. And according to QCD, you are gonna start radiating gluons as the one that I have here, which are soft mostly, also emit at very small angles. And this process of radiating gluons is gonna continue and continue producing this branching until you reach a scale of around 1 GeV of energy, in which the quarks and the gluons are going to become hadrons, and these hadrons are going to be reconstructed as jets. So this is basically intuitively what a jet is, or what a pair of jets, or how they are produced. And these jets are reconstructed in experiments using algorithms such as the anti-KT algorithm, which is the one that is the most used one at the LHC. And the idea of doing so is that a jet algorithm is kind of a recipe that allows us to translate what the experimental is measuring to something we can compute, because it's in principle much easier, which doesn't mean it's super easy, but it's much easier to compute from the theory side something that you can compare to a jet algorithm that just looking at the states of lots of hadrons. And the idea is that these jets are proxies of the initial partons that were outgoing from the hard scatterers of these hard partons, and they are better proxies of these hard partons than just looking at, for instance, the most energetic hadron in the jet. So that's why we have jets and why we use jets. And of course, we could just dedicate 1 hour to understand this branching process and talk about jets and jet algorithms and the reconstruction. But I know you have Jack Holwyn in 1 month that probably will dedicate lots of time to this because he comes from the proton community. But what I want to talk is about heavy ions, so I will not discuss more the details of these jets. But before going to heavy ions, I wanted to motivate or highlight how jets have been fundamental in the study of QCD, the theory of the strong interactions, but in general in the study of collider physics since the 70s. So I brought here an example of an event in E plus E minus collisions that took place in the 70s at LEP in DESI in Germany. Sorry, at DESI in Germany. And in these collisions, the most common event that you have is corresponds to these diagrams where you produce a quark and anti-quark pair, and each of the quark and anti-quark are going to produce jets that you see in the detectors as collimated sprays of particles. But according to QCD, you should also expect even less frequency than these two jets events, that the quark or the anti-quark can radiate gluons. And these gluons, if they are hard enough, can give rise to events where you have 3 jets, one corresponding to the quark, another to the anti-quark, and another one to the gluon. And the measurement for the first time of these jets, of these 3 jets events that happened in 1979 at DESI, is the first experimental evidence of the existence of the gluon. So jets have been really fundamental in the study of QCD, and they continue to be fundamental nowadays. Jets are used, are measured and studied and used in proton-proton collisions at the LHC in a daily basis. Jets are produced in many events, and they can be in pairs, like back-to-back. They can be recoiling a photon, and you also have events with a higher multiplicity of jets. And they are used for many things, including, for instance, extractions of the strong coupling constant, alpha S, or for extractions of parton distribution functions, PDFs, or for beyond the standard model searches. And what this means is that there has been quite a lot of people that have dedicated a lot of their time to try to understand and study these jets, both from the theory and experimental sides. So which means that we have nowadays quite a good understanding of the jets that are produced in E plus E minus collisions and in proton-proton collisions. And this is good because if we have a good understanding of jets in proton-proton collisions, then can be our baseline against to which compare the jets in heavy ion collisions that we are trying to understand. So now I'm gonna move to heavy ion collisions. If there is a question about anything that I have just said, this is a good moment. If not, I will just move to heavy ion collisions. Okay. Well, so I decided to start with these two events, one from CMS, another one is from Atlas of heavy ion collisions where there have been jets produced. So on the left, we have the equivalent to this proton-proton event where you produce 2 jets back-to-back, but in heavy ion collisions. And on the right, we have the one where instead of having a jet, you have an isolated photon recoiling the jet back-to-back. And if you have pay a little bit of attention to the events that I have from proton-proton or E plus E minus conditions, you will immediately notice that there is a big difference between these events and the other events, and is that the jets here are much less clear because there are lots of tracks or lots of also event activity that doesn't come from the jets, or lots of energy deposit here in the calorimeters. So if we compare, for instance, to the previous slide, we see the 2 jets or the 3 jets, but then we don't see many more tracks than those. There are a few, but it's not the same as we see here. And this is basically the first thing that happens in heavy ion collisions, and is that together with the jets, you have quite a lot of particles. Actually, in heavy ion collisions, you can produce up to 400 more particles than in minimum bias proton-proton collisions. And that makes the reconstruction from the experimental side of jets extremely more challenging. The experimentalists in heavy ion collisions have been like really doing a great job in reconstructing these jets and subtracting the background, because all these particles act as background for the jet reconstruction. So that's why if you go to a heavy ion jet experimental talks, they will spend quite a lot of time talking about background. And the idea is, okay, we have these jets, what can we do with them, and what are all these tracks that do not come from a hard scattering? And for that, I will have to do like a brief introduction to heavy ion collisions that I know some of you know very well, but for some others might be slightly new. So what are all these tracks and what's going on here? So heavy ion collisions are collisions of heavy atomic nuclei, where the nuclei travel at almost the speed of light, and thus they are Lorentz contracted along the beam axis. So when they collide, there is such an amount of energy deposited in such a small volume that the energy density achieved, or the temperature to achieve, is so high, of around 500 MeV, that the protons and the neutrons within the nuclei break apart, and they release their quarks and gluons that form this state of matter that we call the quark-gluon plasma, or QGP. This quark-gluon plasma, unfortunately, lives for a very short time, of around 10 Fermi over C, and that means we cannot directly see it. And during this time, what happens is that the quark-gluon plasma, this made of quarks and gluons, starts to expand and cool down until reaching a temperature of around 154 MeV, in which the quarks and gluons become hadrons, and these hadrons are detected in the detector. So when we see events as the ones we had before, all these tracks come from the debris of hadrons that were before the quark-gluon plasma, and they come from soft scatterings between the partons within the nucleons in the nuclei. So mostly when we collide heavy ion collisions, we have soft scatterings that produce the quark-gluon plasma, and from time to time we have on top of that these hard scatterings that produce the jets, and this production, this original hard scattering, is basically the same as in proton-proton collisions. And the question now is where these collisions happen and for how long have we been studying this. And well, heavy ion collisions happen in 2 colliders, the relativistic heavy ion collider RIC, which is in the state of New York, and who have been, at RIC, there have been heavy ion collisions for 25 years. We are in the 25 actually year anniversary of heavy ion collisions at RIC. And then at the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, where there have been heavy ion collisions since 2010. So during all these years, there have been quite a lot of collection of data, and we have learned what I would say is quite a lot about this quark-gluon plasma that is produced in these collisions. But of course, there are still many questions and many challenges ahead, and many things that we need to still figure out. So if we cannot see this quark-gluon plasma because it lives very, very shortly, how are we so sure that we are producing a quark-gluon plasma, and how can we learn about its properties or about its formation? And well, after 25 years, you can imagine that we are pretty sure we are producing a quark-gluon plasma. And actually, there are lots of pieces of evidence, lots of different signatures of the production of the quark-gluon plasma. But today, I will just briefly discuss 2 of them. and on the left, I will talk about this low PT collectivity, which is the strong collective behavior that low energy particles present in heavy ion collisions. And in the rest of this talk, I will use the word energy and transverse momentum, or PT, as in the same way. They are interchangeable. And when I talk about low energy particles, I refer to particles that are around 1 or 2 GeV, and that come from the debris of the quark gluon plasma. So this low PT, this collective behavior, I think it's very well illustrated in this event, where we have a very strong azimuthal asymmetry, where we see many more particles produced in this direction than in this direction. And this is a signature of the collective behavior of the quark gluon plasma. On the other side, we have high energy probes, high energy particles, and with this I will mean around 100 GeV or even more. And what happens is that there is a suppression of the yields of these high energy hadrons or high energy jets in heavy ion collisions relative to our expectations from proton-proton collisions. And this is what we call jet quenching, and will be the main focus of this seminar. So before talking about jet quenching in more detail, I wanted to discuss a little bit what happens with this low PT sector, and what is the main picture that emerges from the study of this low energy sector. So let's take first a look at correlations between pairs of particles in proton-proton collisions. So these are low energy particles. I look at correlations between pairs in their as a function of their separation in azimuth and in pseudo rapidity. So this is what you get, and what you see here is this very clear structure, this peak at separation 0 in pseudo rapidity and in azimuth, which comes from correlations of pairs of particles that belong to the same jet or to the same hadron resonance decay, and thus they are very close in pseudo rapidity and in azimuth. Then when we look at this side, we also see here all these correlations that are long range in pseudo rapidity and that happen at a separation in azimuth of around pi. So these are correlations between a particle that was part of a jet and another one that was part of a jet that was flying back to this jet. And thus they have to be separated in azimuth and angle pi. And if you do the kinematics of this, you will see that the pseudo rapidity is not constrained, and that's why you see this long stricter in pseudo rapidity. Now, this is what we have in proton-proton minimum bias collisions. What happens if instead of looking at these two particle correlations in proton-proton collisions, we look at heavy ion collisions? And what happens in heavy ion collisions is that on top of these structures that we already have in proton-proton collisions, we have these structures here, which are correlations that are long range in pseudo rapidity, but happen as a separation of azimuth of around 0. And this is what we call a near side ridge, and this is a signature of the collective behavior of the quark gluon plasma. So a medium obeys collective behavior when it follows a pressure-driven expansion. So if we imagine that we have a heavy ion collision now that happens perpendicular to this screen, and then in this collision, let's imagine that the nuclei do not fully overlap. So we have this initial spatial anisotropy that we can see here in this cartoon. This initial spatial anisotropy is going to create pressure gradients, and these gradients are going to produce more momentum in this long direction than in this short direction, than in this long direction. And this is how collectivity or hydrodynamics translates an initial spatial anisotropy into azimuthal momentum anisotropy. Indeed, this is how this initial elliptic shape is transformed through hydrodynamics to ellipticity in momentum space, that we can see very clearly here at this very characteristic shape in the two particle correlations that is very well described by this coefficient that we call elliptic flow, or V2. But indeed, of course, this picture is slightly oversimplified because the nuclei do not look like this, like hard spheres. They contain nucleons, and these nucleons have a structure and they fluctuate event by event. So apart from this coefficient V2, due to these fluctuations, we can have higher order coefficients, such as the triangularity V3 or the V4, V5, and so on. And all these coefficients have been measured at the LHC in two particle correlations for different particle species, for pions, protons, kaons, so on. And they have been measured also for different degree of overlap between the nuclei, for different centralities. And all these coefficients are really well described by hydrodynamics. So the main point of hydrodynamics is that it's an expansion around, it's a gradient expansion around local equilibrium. So this means that if my system is close enough to equilibrium, its description gets really simplified because the only information that I need to predict or to compute its dynamics is to solve the energy momentum conservation, to solve basically this first order differential equation. And as this is a first order differential equation, we need an initial condition, which is the initial energy deposit in the collision. And we also need some input, which is the equation of a state that usually is taken from lattice QCD, which relates the pressure to the energy density. So if you take these initial conditions and this input and you solve numerically this kind of equations, you can do fits to all this data of the harmonics at the LHC. And you can do Bayesian fits and extract these coefficients here in red. That is what we call viscosities. So these coefficients are kind of like a measure of how good your fluid is, how efficient is your fluid in transforming this initial spatial anisotropy into momentum anisotropy. And I'm plotting here the result of the eta over S, which is the shear viscosity to entropy density ratio, as a function of the temperature for the quark gluon plasma compared to other known liquids. And what you see is that the eta over S of the quark gluon plasma is quite low. And actually, the quark gluon plasma is the liquid with the lowest eta over S that we know in the universe. So this means that the quark gluon plasma is the most perfect liquid we know, the one that more efficiently transforms this initial spatial anisotropy into momentum anisotropy. And if this is already quite surprising and quite cool, it's even more because this eta over S is so small that it's very close to this lower bound that comes from ADS CFT, which is telling you that the quark gluon plasma is the most strongly coupled fluid known in the universe, which means that basically we have seen, we have from the hadron debris of the quark gluon plasma, we have clearly seen and inferred this liquid behavior, but we have never seen any particle-like behavior. We just see a liquid. And this raises to me many interesting questions. And the most general one is, how does a strongly coupled liquid emerges from a theory as QCD? How can we understand the emergence of this liquid from the microscopic interactions in QCD? And of course, this is not an easy question to answer. And unfortunately, looking at this low PT sector and these two particle correlations, while they have been extremely fundamental and they have been really good to learn about this liquid behavior, they are not sensitive to how this liquid is formed, how this process of hydrodynamization takes place. So it's not an easy question to answer, and there are many things that people try to do to answer this question. But one of the things you can try to do is to try to study the quark-gluon plasma at different resolution scales. And unfortunately, as the quark-gluon plasma is very short-lived, we cannot just send external probes. We cannot do a deep inelastic scattering experiment of the quark-gluon plasma. But what we can use is the jets that are also produced sometimes when we collide heavy nuclei. So they are produced on top of this quark-gluon plasma to try to prove the quark-gluon plasma at different resolution scales. So this is going to be basically the focus of the rest of my talk. And I don't know if there is any questions up to now.
All good.
Okay. Okay, so I will go ahead. And what we are going to talk about is jets in heavy ion collisions. And I have here these two events that I already showed you before when we started talking about heavy ion collisions. But now we are going to look at them a little bit more closely. So if we think about what happens in proton-proton collisions when you produce in an event just two jets that are back-to-back, these jets tend to have roughly the same energy just for energy momentum conservation. But if we look at these events in heavy ion collisions that I have here more closely, what you will already notice is that this jet here, for instance, seems to have deposited more energy in the calorimeters than this one. So maybe these two jets do not have the same energy. Or even more clear here, if we have an isolated photon recoiling a jet in proton-proton collisions, we would expect them also to have roughly the same energy. But here, clearly, the photon has deposited much more energy in the calorimeters than the jets. And actually, the numbers of the energies are here. I don't know if they are very visible, so I make them a little bit larger. And what we see is clearly that the jet doesn't have the same energy of the photon. And what happens is that the jet has interacted with the quark-gluon plasma, and we call these interactions of quenching. And the most obvious consequence of this quenching has been that the jet has lost energy. So jets, as I told you already at the beginning of this talk, in heavy ion collisions, they are produced at when the collisions take place, at the first instance of the collision. And this production, this hard scattering that leads to the production of the jets is not modified by the quark-gluon plasma just because it happens in a much shorter time scale than the formation of the QGP or even its pre-equilibrium stages. And this also means that the jets are producing here in the initial state, and then they witness the full evolution of the system from the formation of the quark-gluon plasma to its expansion and cool down through hydrodynamics and also the hadron regime. And in these stages, they interact with the medium they see, especially they interact with the quark-gluon plasma because as jets are made of quarks and gluons, they interact through the strong interaction with the quark-gluon plasma. And due to these interactions, they get modified with respect to our baseline jets in proton-proton collisions. And the ensemble of these modifications is what we call jet quenching. And of course, the jet quenching is sensitive to the properties of the quark-gluon plasma. And what it makes jets both complicated but also cool from my point of view is that as they are extended objects and they are produced at the initial moment of the collisions, they witness the full evolution of the system, and they can prove the system at all times and at many different resolution scales, which of course makes it complicated because you have to have control of many things, but also makes it exciting because you can think of using jets to prove the quark-gluon plasma at different stages, or even use jets to try to prove different stages of the evolution of the medium, including the pre-equilibrium stages and not only the QGP phase. And of course, this is challenging, and this is something that the community has been trying to do for years. And what I will try to do in the rest of the talk is to show you the main, mostly experimental results and how we interpret them. To show you how these jets indeed change with respect to proton-proton collisions due to their interactions to the quark-gluon plasma. So you can say what we have learned so far about our heavy ion jets.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yes.
I'm just curious,
it's always confused me on the sort of timing and position of the jets relative to the quark-gluon plasma. If I'm sort of imagining that these jets are produced at the initial hard collision, and then we have two hard particles traveling out.
Yes.
And I'm sort of imagining that the quark-gluon plasma is expanding out from this hard collision. Just in terms of timescales, it feels like at a sort of a cartoony image, it feels like the jets should have sort of escaped the formation of the quark-gluon plasma before it's been able to form fully, just based on the sort of timescales involved. Is there a more better way to think about that?
So, okay, the production of the initial quark or gluon that initiates the jet, this very high energy quark that initiates the jet, happens at a time scale that is 1 over the energy of this quark. So if your quark is very energetic, let's say 200 GeV, then this time scale is very small. So it's much smaller than any other scale that you can think, time scale related to the medium evolution, like 1 over the saturation scale for the first phase of the pre-equilibrium, or even much shorter than the 1 Fermi where the hydro starts. But then this is the first parton. But then this parton starts emitting gluons, and you have more gluons and more gluons, and all this branching is going to continue up to the point that you have transformed, you have started at 200 GeV and you have arrived to 1 GeV. So this, it happens on top of the quark-gluon plasma evolution, and this is what you see here, that it travels all the time scales until it reaches this 1 GeV, and you get hadrons. So the full branching, all this branching happens through these phases, and that's kind of unavoidable because you started at very high energies and you need some time to reach the energy at which quarks and gluons hadronize, because you cannot talk about perturbative QCD anymore. So I don't know if this reply to your question.
I think it does. I'll think about it more.
Okay, that's fine. You can ask later also if you want. So now I'm going to talk to you about these consequences of this picture of the jets propagating through all the stages of the evolution and how they get modified. And what I have in the events that I showed you before is that the first more obvious consequence is that jets lose energy. So here I have more events where we see two jets that are back-to-back in proton-proton collisions and that roughly have the same energy, but then we have in heavy ion collisions a very asymmetric event when one of the jets have presumably lost half of its energy, more than half of its energy. And of course, this is not like a proper way of quantifying things. Just look at pictures of events. So how do we quantify this energy loss, which is the first and most obvious consequence of jet quenching? And before doing so, I'm going to just tell you why these jets, in a very brief way, how these jets lose energy. And what happens is that I'm showing here, instead of two jets back to back, a photon plus a jet, because I didn't want to draw two jets. So I was a little bit lazy. And you see in proton-proton collisions, I put them of the same energy, but in heavy ion collisions, they have different energy. And what happens is that your jet, your hard stuttering happens, and then you start having all these emissions. And I'm in this cartoon, I'm putting in black all the emissions that would have been there even if there was no QGP. All these emissions that were there already in proton-proton collisions that we also we refer to them as vacuum emissions, as we have here. But then what also happens is that the quarks and gluons within the jets are going to interact with the quark-gluon plasma, and this is going to produce extra radiation that I'm putting in red. And this radiation is what we call medium-induced radiation, which is nothing more than the QCD equivalent of bremsstrahlung. The quarks propagate through a medium, and due to the interactions with the medium, they emit gluons in the same way that an electron propagating through a medium emits photons. And this bremsstrahlung or medium-induced radiation more likely ends outside of what we reconstruct as a jet, outside of our jet cone. And that's when you measure the jets in heavy ion collisions, they have lost energy. And this is basically the main contribution to energy loss. And this has been studied for more than 25 years. But how do we quantify this? How do we really measure this in experiments? And well, I think the most emblematic observable in jets in heavy ion collisions is what we call the nuclear modification factor, or RAA, which measures your yields of jets, in this case, in lead-lead collisions, with respect to a scale yield in proton-proton collisions. So what you would expect is that if your jets do not lose energy, this ratio should be 1. And this is exactly what you're seeing here for these yellow, pink, and orange data points, which corresponds to photons W and Z bosons. And this is happening for all these bosons because they are colorless, so they cannot interact through the strong interaction with the QGP, and then they have an RAA that is 1. But then when we look at the jets and the hadrons in this high energy sector here, what we see is that the RAA is below 1, and this is a signature of quenching of this energy loss that we were discussing up to now. So the fact that we have colorless probes with a RAA that is around 1 within the uncertainties of the data is telling us that indeed our interpretation of this quenching is somehow correct. At least qualitatively, we are understanding the things well. Then we can also study this nuclear modification factor, this RAA, as a function of the energy of the jets for collisions with a different degree of overlap. For collisions with different degree of overlap, as we see here. And what happens is that if your collisions are very central, if the nuclei overlap a lot when the collision takes place, you produce a hotter and denser medium, which is also lasts longer in time. So your interactions between the jet and the medium are stronger, and you expect the jets to get more modified and to also lose more energy. And that's what you're seeing here. When we move from very central collisions to peripheral collisions, the RAA increases, which means that your energy loss decreases. So we have quite a good, a nice qualitative picture of energy loss. But of course, there is one question here, and is if the jets lose energy, where does this energy go?
I ask a question. When you're plotting the PT there, it's going up to like 100 GeV. So that I assume is the jet PT. So are you taking like all the partons in the jet and then adding them up together to give you a PT? Or
the jet PT is what you get. So you arrive, is what you get from the jet algorithm. So you start with a parton, it radiates, and that's what we can compute from QCD. But what experimentalists do is they measure the final hadrons, and they, with an algorithm, they get this cone, this jet, and the PT is just the sum, the vectorial sum of the PTs of the hadrons within the jet. So basically, these jet algorithms allows them to translate the energy that they deposit in the calorimeters, the particles that they detect, into a jet PT, which is the sum of the jet PTs of the particles in the jet, and a jet radius, which is the side of the jets. So that's the PT. And this will be in all the plots here. So it's good that you ask these questions now.
Thank you.
Should I move to the next slide?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay. So now I was saying, where does this energy go? Because I guess we all know that energy is conserved. So it cannot disappear. I mean, if suddenly you have less energy in your event and you're not conserving the energy, you may be very worried that your detector is broken, or maybe you're very happy that you have found some new physics. But this is not what's going on here in heavy ion collisions. I wanted to show this plot that basically tell us that the picture that we are having from this jet quenching is correct, is what's going on. So for that, I'm going to show you this slide. I think it's slightly complicated because the plots are not easy to follow, but I think the message in the end is quite simple. So I hope to, even if I don't manage to really explain well the plots, at least I managed to convey the main message of this slide. So now we look at events where you produce two jets that are almost back to back, like the one that I have here. And we have the leading jet in the event, which is the one with the most energy, and the subleading jet. And we can define this asymmetry here, which is the difference between the energies divided by the sum of their energies. So the largest is AJ, the more asymmetric the event is, the more difference in the energy of the jets there is. And we can use this as the x-axis of this plot. So on the left, we have jets that are very balanced, that they are basically the two of them of almost the same energy. And on the right, very unbalanced events with one of the jets having lost much more energy than the other one. And on the y-axis, we have something that we have called, or the experimentalists have called, missing PT, or missing energy, which is just the energy of all these tracks in this event, not only the ones in the jets, all the ones that you see here, but projected to the direction of the leading jet. So that means that the energies on one hemisphere, on the hemisphere of the leading jet, are gonna contribute negatively to the missing energy, while these ones, they are gonna contribute positively, which means that if the energy is conserved, then your missing energy, when you look at all the tracks in the band, should be zero. And this is what we are seeing here within the uncertainties. These circles these black circles are compatible with zero, even when the two jets are very asymmetric in energy. And that means that in the full event, taking all the tracks here, the energy is conserved and you are not missing any energy. So the CMS detector who did this measurement is not broken, is working well. But still you have jets that have lots of different energy. So if we look inside the jets, what happens is that we have much more energy in the direction of the leading jet. So what is going on here is that you are all including the tracks that are inside the jets. So when your two jet events are asymmetric, you have missing energy because this one will have 70 GeV and this one will have 200 GeV. So you will have more energy in the direction of the leading jet than in the direction of the subleading jet. And when we do the opposite, and we all include the ones that are out of the jets, so you're only including particles in this blue area here, then you get the opposite result. You have more energy in the direction of the subleading jets. So this is telling us that the energy is conserved, and the energy that this jet lost, in this case 130 GeV approximately, appear as soft particles that are not reconstructed in the jet, they are outside the jet. And actually these soft particles that appear outside the jet, they do not appear only very close to the jet. You really need to do the full hemisphere to recover all the energy, which means that you have to go very far away from the jet. And to me, this already points out, and this is not like an evidence, but it's something that is telling us that probably the jets are not only experiencing medium-induced radiation, because it's very unlikely for medium-induced radiation to produce gluons that go so far away from the jet. And there is something else, and this something else that many people have been studying for years might be what we call a medium response. So the main point is everything works well. There is new physics. There is no new physics. There is no broken detector. The energy that the jet loses just appears as particles that are not part of the jet and that they are in the full hemisphere. So before going to the last part of the talk, I wanted to just have a more theoretical slide, because up to now everything has been experimental plots, to tell you what are the modifications we expect to see in the jets in the quark gluon plasma. So the one we have discussed a lot is energy loss caused by this medium-induced radiation. whose main building block or diagram is the one we have here, where you have the quarks or gluons within the jet experiencing these blue interactions with the quark-gluon plasma that produce radiation of gluons that mostly end outside of the jet cone and give rise to energy loss. This also produced a phenomenon that we call broadening, and is that due to these kicks, these partons change the transverse momentum. And this is the first modification that was ever predicted and has been studied for more than almost 30 years now. And there have been many people that have contributed to the study of medium-induced radiation, including Will, that you have there, who is now even extending these studies to smaller systems as proton-light collisions. But apart from that, we expect other things. So one phenomenon that heavy ion physicists have been searched for a lot is what we call color decoherence, and is the idea that when you have splittings, like similar to these ones in the jets, if this split, as the QGP introduces some resolution scale, which is related to its properties, to its transport properties, if this splitting happens at a very large angle compared to this resolution scale, so if this splitting is resolved by the resolution scale of the quark-gluon plasma, what is going to happen is that this gluon and this quark are going to radiate new gluons independently, and they are going to produce much more radiation than if they happen at a very small angle and they are not resolved by the quark-gluon plasma and they emit like a single prong. And this is what I have like in this cartoon here, that what we expect is that broad jets, like jets that are fat, will have more of those very large angle splittings, and then they will have more energy loss than narrow jets. And this is an effect that we've been searching for, but unfortunately it's not as easy as it looks like, but it's a direct consequence of perturbative QCD. So in my view, it has to be there. This is something unavoidable. The question is more how big this effect is, because it could happen that, for instance, this resolution scale of the quark-gluon plasma is so little that all your jets are resolved and you always end in this picture, or is so big that you always end in this picture. How big is this effect? Is this like a 5%, or this is a super huge effect? And that's kind of the questions we are asking as a community. And on the other side, we also have a medium response that I mentioned before. And this is the idea that the jets get modified by the QGP, but also the QGP modify the jets. And this can be seen as the fact that if you have a jet that propagates through the quark-gluon plasma losing energy, some of this energy will be deposited into the QGP, and part of the QGP is going to flow in the direction of the jet, as this duct that we see here that is moving part of the water in its direction. And what happens, the consequence of this phenomena is that you're going to have an increase of soft particles, of soft hadrons in the direction of the jet. And that's why it's very difficult to disentangle this phenomena, because energy loss or broadening, they also produce this increase of soft particles. So how you separate these effects is an open question, and it's a difficult problem. However, something that was very recent, not even 1 year ago, is that if you have more medium flowing in the direction of the jet, by energy momentum conservation, you should have in the opposite direction of the jet less medium flowing, and this would be a decrease of soft particles. And this decrease, the first signals of this decrease have been measured by CMS. So if I have time in the end, I will show you the measurement, because this is the first experimental signals of the existence of this phenomena that we all expect. And while it has not yet been observed inside the jets, it has been observed through these signals in the back hemisphere from the jet. So now I'm going to move to jet substructure observable. I try to tell you what we have learned about the jet so far, how these heavy ion jets differ from the ones in proton-proton collisions, and how we try to interpret this difference, which is a very difficult task. So the first result I wanted to show is these differential jet shapes. So differential jet shapes measure how the energy is distributed inside the jets in the direction R, which is transverse to the jet axis. So what I'm showing here is the jet shape as a function of this transverse direction to the jet axis R for lead-lead in red and proton-proton collisions in blue. And the first column are very more peripheral collisions, so where the nuclei overlap not as much as on the right column where we have very central collisions. And if we look at the top panels, what we have is the jet shape as a function of R, and what we see is that most of the energy of the jets is carried very close to their cores for very small r's. And then there is less energy carried close to the edge of the jets. And this is the case both in proton-proton and in heavy ion collisions. But when we take the ratio of these jet shapes in heavy ions with respect to proton-proton collision, what we see is that there is a clear enhancement here and here, which means that heavy ion jets carry more soft particles toward the edge of the cone than proton-proton jets. And this, of course, is this modification is larger for central collisions than for more peripheral collisions, because always these effects increase when you go to central collisions because you have more interactions with a hotter and longer-lived medium. Now, the problem is how you interpret this, because this is exactly what you expect from medium-induced radiation, from energy loss and increase on the soft particles at large angles within the jet, but this is also what you expect from medium response. And indeed, theoretical models have been able to describe this data only with medium-induced radiation, and some others with both medium-induced radiation and medium response. And this is already telling us how difficult it is to disentangle the different phenomena that jets experience when they propagate through the quark-gluon plasma. Then we can also look at jet fragmentations, which what it looks is how the hadrons, mostly pions within the jets, are distributed inside of the jets as a function of their energy. So what we see here is the ratio of the jet fragmentation in lead-lead with respect to proton-proton collision as a function of the fraction of energy of the hadron with respect to the jet energy. So here we will have the more energetic hadrons within the jet, the leading hadrons, and here we will have the subhadrons. And what we see is, again, that there is an increase of subhadrons within heavy ion jets relative to proton-proton jets. And this is nice. This is what we expect from medium-induced radiation, but also, again, what we expect from medium response. So it's very hard to disentangle these effects. Now I will show you a completely different observable, which is a type of gluon observables. These observables that are where grooming is applied were defined in principle to have a better perturbative control from the theory side of the observable, because grooming is a technique that allows us to remove soft and wide-angle radiation, which is much more difficult to compute from the point of view of QCD than collinear radiation. And the idea is that, I'm going to start by this cartoon, that you have a jet, and once you have a jet, you have your particles here. You can reconstruct a jet tree, and this was done particularly with a Cambridge-Eigen algorithm, which means that they are just following the branches in angular order, so merging branches that are close to each other in angle. And once you have the jet tree drawing here, you start here at the beginning, at the proxy for the initial of your jet tree. And what you do is, I arrive here to this splitting, and I ask this splitting to meet a criterion, which is the soft drop criterion. And if the splitting meets the criterion, I stop there. But if it does not meet the criterion, what I have to do is to continue. And the criterion, what it's doing is just asking the two branches of this splitting to be hard enough. So in this case, in this particular plot, is asking them that the two of them carry at least a 20% of the energy. So you cannot have a branch that is 10% and another one that is 90%, for instance. And this is what's going on here. we do not meet the criterion. So what the algorithm does is, okay, if you don't meet the criterion because this branch is very soft, what I'm going to do is follow the hardest branch. And I follow this purple branch, and then I look at the next splitting. And if I meet the criterion, I stop. And in this case, it has met the criterion. And once you have stopped, you look at the angle of this splitting, and this is theta g. So theta g is basically a proxy for the angle of the hardest splitting within our jet. And once I have done this for a jet, I can do this for many jets, and I can do it both in lead and PP, and get a distribution of theta g and do a ratio, and this ratio is the nuclear modification factor. So what we see here is the nuclear modification factor as a function of theta g, and what we see is that jets with a very large theta g are more suppressed than jets with a small theta g. So fatter jets are more suppressed than narrow jets, and this is what we call narrowing, because the ones that are fatter are more suppressed than the ones that are narrow. And when you see this, you are like, oh, fantastic, this could be color decoherence, because this is exactly what we expect from color decoherence, that fatter jets will have more independent emittance, so they will lose more energy than narrow jets. But unfortunately, life in heavy ions is always more complicated. You cannot say that this is an evidence of color decoherence, because there is something that always happens when you measure jets at a given PT, and is that you are always biased. And this is an unavoidable consequence on the fact that when we select jets to do this kind of measurements, we select jets according to their energies, or PTs, which means that you're doing a ratio between heavy ion and PP jets at the same measured energy, but the heavy ion jets lost energy. So they don't come from hard scatterings where the hard partons were produced at the same energy. In other words, if we do a ratio between 200 GeV jets in lead and proton jets, the 200 GeV jets in proton jets correspond, or they are a good proxy for a hard scattering where the hard parton was 200 GeV. But in heavy ions, as there has been a loss of energy, these jets were initiated at higher energies of, I don't know, 220 GeV, for instance. And that means that you are never comparing apples to apples. You are never comparing the same population of jets. And that's unfortunately because the production of these hard partons in these hard scatterings decreases with the probability for producing these hard partons in hard scatterings decreases with the PT, which is shown here in this black line, which means that you are much more likely to produce a 300 GeV jet than a 500 GeV jet, for instance. So if you look at heavy ion jets that are 200 GeV in energy, they are much more likely to come from a 300 GeV parton than from a 500 GeV parton. So you're always biased to see the jets that lose the least energy, and that by definition are narrow jets. Why narrow? Because they have less activity than broad jets. So the summary of this selection bias is that you're always biased to see the jets that lose less energy, and in this case are narrow jets. So you cannot say that this narrowing is color coherence, because you don't know if in reality the jets are getting narrow due to the interactions with the quark-gluon plasma, or that you are just detecting the narrow jets because the wider jets were less likely to survive to your PT cut. This is slightly technical, but I will mention this in my next seminar next week, so I wanted to already introduce it now. I will repeat it, don't worry. So we all start talking about selection bias now. And now, just to end, I have I think 2 more slides, which are the most recent measurements. I wanted just to introduce energy correlators, because this will be the topic of my next talk. So energy correlators are formally defined as correlations of the energy flux, and I will talk more about this in next week. But today, I only wanted to show you an example of 2-point correlators. So the 2-point energy correlator is schematically is something like this. You look for an event that contains jets, and then you go into the jet and look at correlations between pairs of particles weighted by their energy as a function of their angular separation. So I look for all the pairs and I correlate it as a function of their angular separation weighted by their energies, or PTs, and per jet I get histograms like this one. And then I take many events with many jets and I get a distribution, and in proton-proton collisions this distribution looks like this, which is a very particular shape, where we see here a regime that we call the perturbative regime, where you see the correlations that come from the partons within the jet, and then we see a peak, which is the hadronization peak, and then the correlations between the hadrons. So basically, in the 2-point energy correlator as a function of the angular separation, what you're seeing is your full evolution of the jet. You're seeing the partonic part, the branching, and then the hadronization, and then the hadron regime, where you have just the correlators between the hadrons. And I will explain this in lots of details next week. But today, what I wanted to say is that this peak appears at a scale that is of the order of lambda QCD divided by the initial energy of the jet, the energy of the quark outgoing from the, or gluon, outgoing from the hard scattering. So what happens when we measure this in heavy ion collisions instead of proton-proton collisions? And what happens is that instead of this black curve, which would be the result in proton-proton collisions, we have the red one. And the first thing that we can observe in the red one is that the position of the peak has changed. The hadronization peak in the heavy ion measurement appears at a smaller RL than with respect to the PP peak. And what's going on there is that as this peak appears at a scale as lambda QCD divided by the initial PT of the jet before losing energy, and you're looking at jets at the same energy, of the same final energy in proton-proton and heavy ion collisions, the jets in heavy ion collisions came from originally a higher energy. So maybe these jets were 150 GeV and they end up in this energy between 120 and 140. Actually, they were a convolution of jets of many higher energies that end up in this range. And that means that lambda QCD divided by PT, the initial PT, is smaller because the PT is larger in heavy ions than in PP, and the peak shifts to the left. And this is the energy loss or the selection bias. So that means that in the 2-point energy correlator, in energy correlators, the selection bias has a really particular effect and is shifting the peak of the hadronization. But then if we look at this plot in more detail, and especially if we look at the lead to PP ratio, we see that there is no only modification at the small angles, there is also some modification of large angles, which we don't know yet if it's caused by medium-induced radiation, medium response, or probably both. But we know that it cannot be selection bias because the effect of selection bias is shifting the hadronization peak. And this is pretty cool because it's the first observable, superstructure observable, where we can see that indeed there is some modification that we cannot ever attribute to selection bias, which to me is fantastically cool. Now, just a last plot, this observable, the 2-point energy correlator, has also been measured in proton-lead collisions, which I know that they are of interest of some people in the audience. And what you see is the result for three different jets. And the black points are the lowest PT jets. And you see there is some enhancement, and it's not yet clear what's going on here and why there is some deviation in the proton-lead result with respect to PP at these energies. And just to finalize, as I told you at the beginning, we have not yet found any evidence of medium response inside the jets, but CMS claims to find signals of medium response outside the jet in the other hemisphere. And what they did is to look at jets that are produced recoiling C boson as you show, as shown here in this cartoon. And if this jet produces a wake of positive particles inside the jet, it's very difficult to disentangle this wake inside the jet from other phenomena, because they all have kind of the same consequence, an increase of soft hadrons. But what you would expect is that in the z direction, you will have a depletion of soft particles. And this depletion, we cannot explain it by any other means than by a medium response. And this is exactly what CMS is showing in this plot. They are looking at correlations of charged particle with the C boson. And when you are close to the C boson, which is this side here, in lead-lead collisions, which is the red points, with respect to proton-proton collisions, which is blue, is you see a depletion. And this depletion, we don't have any other phenomenon that we have thought about that could lead to such a depletion. So this depletion is interpreted as this negative wake, this depletion of soft hadrons coming from medium response. Then when we move from these peripheral collisions to, central collisions to peripheral collisions, where there are almost no modifications, and this depletion disappears. So you know it's something that is a QGP effect, and the picture seems to be consistent. So this is what CMS presents as the first signals of this medium response that we have been searching for years. And I think this is pretty cool, because then this will allow people that have models of medium response to improve their model or fit them to this region, and then use that to predict in the region inside the jet. And maybe with these more constrained models, because they have to be constrained to fit this data, we can start thinking about how to disentangle this medium response from other phenomena as medium-induced radiation. So with this plot, I end, and just as a very brief conclusion, I hope I convinced you that jets are cool. They are fun and interesting, and they have been interesting for many areas of particle physics since the 70s. And what we have learned in heavy ion collisions is that jets get modified. They get extremely suppressed. Their RAA actually for central collisions is like 0.4. And they have an enhancement of soft particles, also towards the jet edges. But even we see this thing, it's very difficult to disentangle which are the different phenomena that are producing these modifications. But I think we are like in a very good moment for jet quenching, because with these new measurements, we have nice good years ahead, where with the first signals of medium response and also these new observables, energy correlators, I think we will do lots of progress, because they have nice properties that I will discuss next week. And I think what's coming now in the upcoming 3 years is pretty exciting, and we will do quite a lot of progress. I'm quite convinced. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will be very happy to reply all your questions.
Ben, you're up.
Thank you for the talk, Carlota. Do we have any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I have one on the medium response.
Yes.
So when we talk about the medium response, is that ever modeled in terms of the hydrodynamic variables that you are using to characterize the QGP? Does this have some effect there?
So I would say that first, the medium response is the more model-dependent part of our treatment of the jets. And there are different ways of doing it. So depends on how you do it. Some people, yes, they do a hydrodynamic medium response. And the idea is that imagine that your jet loses energy, and some of this energy gets deposited into the quark gluon plasma. So what they do is that this energy becomes a source term in their hydrodynamic equations, that and then they have to solve again these equations, including the source of energy that comes from the quark gluon plasma. So this is some way of doing it, which is indeed, and this would be indeed a hydrodynamic response to the propagation. Some other people have a completely opposite approach. Instead of being some strongly coupled approach to hydro, is more a weakly coupled approach. And it's just the idea that when imagine you have a splitting, I think I have some drawing of a splitting here. So imagine you have a quark that emits a gluon, then due to an interaction with the quark gluon plasma. So this recoil will then propagate in the direction of the jet, and this is how it is treated in that case. And in that case, it doesn't give rise to any hydrodynamic response. So the idea is that it's a background reaction, and it has to be there because it's energy momentum conservation. If that wasn't there, you wouldn't conserve energy and momentum. Then if the effect is big or not, we don't know yet inside the jets. And then if it's indeed a hydrodynamic response or more something that you can interpret in terms of just recoils, it is not clear either.
Okay, thank you. Any other?
Yes, please can you go to slide 20? Can you explain this plot again? Because I think I understand the rise at the lower end, but I'm not too sure what the rise at the higher end.
Yeah, the rise at low C, what it means is that you have more particles that have low C, which are low PT particles, low energy particles. And that is what we expect from all our intuition of jet quenching. At high C is not that clear. And probably what's going on here that gives rise to this increase is again selection bias. So I didn't want to mention it when I discussed this plot because I hadn't yet talked about selection bias, but an increase of leading hadrons, of the most energetic hadrons within the jet, can be due to the fact that you are always biasing yourself to the jets that lose less energy. And these are jets that are narrower, but also in principle, you also should be biased, for instance, to more jets that are initiated by quarks than by gluons, because the color factor of a quark is 4/3 and for a gluon is 3. So you always expect quark jets to lose less energy in perturbative QCD than gluon jets, just because the color factor is smaller. And if you are more biased to quark jets, you would expect that an enhancement of hard particles in lead relative to PP. So probably this is due to the fact that you are always biased because you are not comparing apples to apples. Yeah. But I don't think there is a clear, well, I will have to look if there are more plots where someone has studied this more in detail.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I seem to hear more discussion of selection bias in recent years than I ever heard before. Have older discussions been revisited with that sort of lens to reassess conclusions that have been out there for a longer time?
So the thing of selection bias is that it's a bias experimentally that you cannot avoid because you're always gonna reconstruct things using the jet PD, but it's physics because it's the physics of energy loss, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is that the physics of energy loss, even I think there are quite a lot of things that we could try to understand better. We have a clear, nice intuition of what is going on from the RAA and all these observables that are older. And I think that the reason why this selection bias have been revisited a lot in the last years is that in the last 7 years or 8 years, we have started doing lots of jet substructure that was not being done in heavy ion collisions before. And when you are looking at jet substructure, you were not trying to measure energy loss. What you wanted to do is to look for hard modifications in the core of the jets or things like that, like color the coherence. And it's not like selection bias is not interesting because it's energy loss, but you were already measuring this with the RAA and you wanted to see something else. And then every time we start looking at jet substructure and they will measure something, and they will find some very cool modifications. Someone will come and is like, oh, this can be explained also by selection bias. So I think that's the pessimistic thing, is that every time you are biased by this selection bias, and if you control the selection bias very well, if you know exactly how much this bias is because you understand very well your energy loss, then you don't care, because you can somehow subtract which part of this effect comes from selection bias and what comes from the physics you are looking for. The problem is that we don't have such a perfect control of this energy loss or selection bias, and that's why every time that any modification you look for looks like selection bias, you get in trouble and you don't know how to separate the two things. And I think the reason is that I don't think it has changed any conclusions about the very old observables about energy loss that we had before. It's just that at the moment we start doing substructure, our goal was to measure something different, and we always end up measuring selection bias, or something that we couldn't separate from.
Yeah, you couldn't separate from.
Yeah.
I think that's
the two things I'm sure are there. All these phenomena is just how you disentangle it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, the more
why I like
complicated the harder it gets, right? This is pretty obvious.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. So I think it's quite an easy one, but basically, we imagine the jets forming from, I guess, two hard partons going back to back from one another, and then the jets form from radiation, more or less, coming from one of those hard partons. But we always see that the jets end up in this like collimated structure, which suggests that most of the radiations happen at small angles. Is there any reason why we shouldn't expect the radiation to happen at larger angles, and you would just wash out that collimated effect?
So why you form jets and why you have this collimated extractor is a consequence of QCD. So if you go to compute a gluon emission, let me say something equivalent to this, but in vacuum, so you don't have these interactions with any medium, these blue things. When you go to compute this kind of diagrams, these diagrams have a soft and a collinear divergence. And that means that you have a very high probability, this is a double log divergence, of emit soft and collinear gluons. It doesn't mean that you're not gonna emit hard gluons, but is much suppressed than emitting soft and collinear gluons. So indeed, when that's the reason why you have jets. It's unavoidable. This is gonna happen. And indeed, this also leads to a consequence, and is that at least a double log accuracy, when you look at a jet in vacuum, it can be very well described by something that we call angular ordering, which is the fact that all the gluons are emitted always in decreasing angles. So that means that your first gluon would be the one with the larger angle, and then the other ones with smaller angles. So that's why you always end up having these collimated sprays of particles. In the QGP, it's slightly different, because this medium-induced radiation doesn't have a collinear divergence anymore. It has the soft divergence, but it doesn't have the soft divergence. It's not a double log, it's a single log, so life is slightly different, but still having a very large angle scattering is much suppressed with respect to having a smaller angle scattering.
Thank you. That looks like all the questions. Thank you, Carlota, for the talk, and we're looking forward to next week's talk as well.
Thank you very much, and see you next week.
Thank you.